Dr. Rincalith had catalogued the deaths of 11 civilizations without ever leaving his chair. That was the nature of his work. He was a xenohistorian, a reader of ruins, a man who understood extinction the way other scholars understood grammar, as a set of rules that, once learned, explained everything. He had never expected the 12th entry in his catalogue to be the one that changed him. The message arrived on a gray morning at the Threll Institute for Comparative Civilizations, delivered not by courier but by an old friend who no longer smiled the way he used to. "They want you on Vulkars," said Administrator Yesh, standing too straight in the doorway of Calith's office, his 4 eyes refusing to settle on any one point. "The consortium is closing the file. Final survey before the planet is reclassified as permanently forbidden. They need someone who can read what's left and write the last word on it." Calith set down his stylus. "Vulkars has been surveyed 9 times. Every expedition that landed either died or fled within a season. What is there left to read?" "That's the interesting part," Yesh said, and for the first time his eyes did settle, all 4 of them, directly on Calith. "Something is transmitting." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a sentence changes the shape of a conversation. "Transmitting what?" "We don't know. It's not a distress call. It's not automated. It repeats every 11 hours, and it has been repeating for 6 years. Whatever launched it is still down there, still powered, still working." Yesh paused. "The consortium wants a xenologist on the ground before they seal the system. If there is a civilization on Vulkars, even the ruins of one, they want it documented before the planet is struck from every star chart that matters." Calith felt something he had not felt in years of cataloging the dead. The small, cold thrill of an actual mystery. He should have refused. Every professional instinct told him to refuse, and every colleague who heard the assignment before he left told him so directly, in the blunt, worried tone reserved for friends about to make an irreversible mistake. Vulkars was not merely dangerous. It was a graveyard with a body count large enough to have its own chapter in the consortium's registry of catastrophic colonization failures, a chapter that students in their first year of xenohistory were required to memorize precisely because it offered such a clean, terrible lesson in the limits of ambition. 12 species, by the official count, had attempted to establish a foothold there. 12 had failed, in ways ranging from the mundane to the horrifying. The planet's atmosphere was thick with corrosive particulates that ate through standard shielding within months. Its gravity sat at a punishing 1.4 standard, enough to grind down joints and hearts not built for it. Storms that regularly exceeded anything recorded on a habitable world tore through the lowlands with lightning strong enough to liquefy sand into glass. And the fauna, what little anyone had managed to document before dying, was fast, intelligent, and did not seem to fear anything that walked on 2 legs. The planet's own name, in 3 different galactic tongues, translated roughly to the same idea. The place that kills. Calith went anyway. He told himself it was professional curiosity. He suspected even then that it was something closer to hope, the hope that after 11 catalogued extinctions, he might finally find something that had not simply died. The transport ship HFY Quiet dropped out of high orbit 3 days later, carrying Calith, a pilot named Dree who had flown into worse places and lived to complain about it, and a security escort of 2 consortium Marines who had clearly been told this was a formality and did not believe it for a second. Vulkars looked, from orbit, almost beautiful. Its cloud bands were the color of dried blood, streaked through with veins of pale yellow where the corrosive atmosphere caught the light. Its surface, glimpsed between storm systems, showed jagged black mountain ranges and wide plains the color of rust. "Scanners are picking up the transmission source," Dree said, her voice tight with concentration as she fought the ship through the outer atmosphere. "Northern Hemisphere, temperate band. There's a structure there. Actually, there's a lot of structures there." Calith leaned over her shoulder to look at the display. What he saw did not match anything in the survey archives. A grid, not ruins. Not scattered debris consistent with a colony that had been overrun and abandoned. A grid, orderly, deliberate, expanding in visible rings from a central point, with roads, and what looked unmistakably like cultivated fields arranged in long straight furrows that followed the contour of a river. "That can't be right," said one of the Marines. a broad-shouldered soldier named Corvo who had spent the entire descent checking his weapon with the particular repetition of someone trying not to think about where they were going. Nothing's supposed to be alive down there except things that want to eat us. Read it again, Caliph said quietly. Read it again. The grid was still there. So was something else, small and moving, in a walled enclosure near what appeared to be the settlement's edge. Livestock, Caliph thought, and did not say aloud, because he did not yet trust himself to believe it. The ship set down 2 kilometers from the transmission source, in a stretch of open ground that the scanners judged stable enough to hold the landing struts. The moment the engines cut, the silence of Vulkars pressed in against the hull, a silence that Caliph had read about in 11 previous mission logs, always followed within hours by the sound of something dying. He found himself listening for it anyway, some old academic reflex expecting the pattern to hold true here as it had held true everywhere else, and was unsettled by how long the silence simply continued to be silence, undisturbed by screaming or static or any of the grim sounds his research had trained him to expect. He checked his environmental suit twice. Then he stepped onto the ramp, and Vulkars breathed on him for the first time. The air outside the ship was the color of a healing bruise, and it moved in a way that felt deliberate, like something circling. Caliph's suit display flashed corrosive particulate warnings within the first 30 seconds, exactly as the survey logs had predicted. His footing was unsteady under the gravity, exactly as the survey logs had predicted. Nothing else was as the survey logs had predicted. They walked toward the grid Dree had found on the scanners, Corvo and the second Marine, a quieter woman named ISS, flanking Caliph with weapons drawn. The ground beneath their boots was hard-packed, worn smooth by traffic. Actual traffic. Ruts. Footprints, layered over each other, some fresh. Someone walked here today, ISS said. They had gone perhaps 400 meters when ISS stopped walking and raised a closed fist, the old signal for hold position that every consortium soldier learned before they learned much else. Movement, she said quietly. Left flank. Low. Caliph followed her gaze into the rust-colored scrub bordering the worn path, and for a moment saw nothing but wind moving through low, waxy vegetation. Then the vegetation resolved itself into something else. A long, low shape, segmented, moving with a fluid, unhurried patience that made the hair on Caliph's arms rise beneath his suit. It was easily 3 meters from nose to tail, plaited along the back in overlapping dark scales, and it was not alone. A second shape moved parallel to the first, 20 meters further out, matching its pace with the coordinated precision of animals that had hunted together for a very long time. That matches the Osvari description, Corvo said, weapon raised now, his voice gone flat and careful. Pack predator. Apex of the local food chain or close to it. Doctor, get behind me. Caliph did not move immediately. He recognized, with the strange clarity of a scholar finally seeing his research made flesh, the exact silhouette described in the Osvari camp's final transmission, the creature that had ended a mining colony of 200 within a single brutal week. The creatures did not charge. That was the detail that struck Caliph even through his own fear. They paced the 3 offworlders at a steady, watchful distance, heads low, clearly assessing rather than attacking, the way a hunter measures an unfamiliar animal before deciding whether it is prey or simply another predator not worth the trouble. They're not engaging, Isis said, disbelief cutting through the tension in her voice. Don't run, Caliph said suddenly, some half-formed instinct surfacing from a dozen behavioral studies he had read on pack hunters across a dozen worlds. Running triggers pursuit in nearly every apex predator species cataloged. Stand your ground. Slowly, they stood. The creatures continued their slow, parallel study for what felt to Caliph like a very long time, though his suit chronometer later insisted it had been less than 90 seconds. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, both shapes peeled away into the scrub and were gone, leaving only a faint rustle and the pounding of Caliph's own pulse in his ears. They've done this before, Corvo said, lowering his weapon with visible effort. That wasn't a hunting approach. That was a patrol. Caliph filed the observation away with hands that were not quite steady, and did not yet understand how correct Corvo's instinct was, that the creatures pacing them through the scrub belonged to the very same pack species he would, within a day, find living in guarded enclosures along a human settlement's eastern wall, answering to names, sleeping beside children, standing sentry against storms. They found the first structure a kilometer further on. A low wall built from fused local stone, capped with something that made Corvo swear under his breath. A lattice of dark metal, clearly manufactured, clearly maintained, running along the wall's top edge and humming faintly with current. "That's a fence," Corvo said. "That is a working, powered fence." Caliph touched the wall's surface with a gloved hand and felt the texture of deliberate craftsmanship, not the accidental architecture of ruins. Someone had built this to keep something out, or in. He thought of the 12 failed colonies. He thought of what the Consortium archive said about each of them: the Threlqui outpost, gone in 4 months, comlogs ending mid-sentence. The Osvari mining camp, its last transmission a single garbled word that translators had never fully agreed on. The joint scientific expedition from 3 allied species that had sent daily reports for 61 days and then nothing at all. He had read those files 100 times each. He knew the shape of failure on Vulkars intimately. This did not have that shape. They followed the fence line until it opened into a gate, and beyond the gate, the settlement revealed itself in full. It was not large, perhaps 200 structures, built low and thick-walled against the storms, roofed in overlapping plates of scavenged and fabricated metal that caught the bruised light and threw it back in dull glints. Smoke rose from several chimneys, thin and gray, dispersing fast in the wind. Fields stretched beyond the settlement's edge, rows of something dark green and waxy-leaved that Caliph did not recognize, growing where the survey logs insisted nothing should grow. And there were people. Caliph stopped walking. Beside him, Corvo's weapon came up on instinct before ISS put a hand on his arm and eased it back down. They were not tall. Not by the standards of most spacefaring species Caliph had studied, shorter than a Threllan, broader through the shoulder, bipedal, with skin in a range of browns and pale tans that suggested generations of adaptation to a sun this world barely let through its clouds. They moved with the economy of people who had spent their entire lives fighting gravity and losing gracefully. Several of them carried tools that were unmistakably weapons as well, long-handled implements with edges that caught the light the way the fence's metal did. One of them saw the offworlders first. A child, Caliph realized with a jolt that went through him like cold water. A child, standing near the fence, small and undeniably young, who turned and looked directly at the 3 strangers in their strange suits and did not run. The child shouted something in a language the translator strapped to Caliph's wrist had never heard before, and within 30 seconds the settlement was in motion. Not fleeing, not attacking, but responding with the fast, coordinated calm of people who had drilled for exactly this moment and knew precisely what to do. "They're not panicking," ISS said, low and disbelieving. "They're organizing." Figures took up positions along the fence line, weapons ready but not raised. Others were herding what looked like children and elderly toward the settlement's center, quickly and without chaos. It was, Caliph understood with a strange, vertiginous clarity, a defensive posture. Practiced, rehearsed. The posture of a people who had survived being surprised before and had decided, collectively, that it would not happen to them again. A figure approached the gate alone. Older than the others, gray-haired, moving with a pronounced limp that spoke of an old injury never properly healed, but carrying nothing in their hands. A deliberate gesture, Caliph understood, of showing empty palms to strangers. "I'm a xenologist," Caliph said slowly into his translator, hoping the device would find some common linguistic root fast enough to matter. "I study, I document. I mean no harm. We detected a transmission. We came to see who sent it." The translator stuttered through half a dozen failed attempts before something clicked, some structural similarity between this language and one already in its archive, and produced a rough approximation. The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed. A short, tired sound, more exhausted than amused. "You're the first ones who ever asked," he said. "Instead of just shooting." His name, once the translator settled into something reliable, was Bertrand Osei, and he was, as far as Caliph could determine over the following hours, the oldest living human on Vulkars. He led them past the fence, past the fields, into the settlement's central hall. A long, low building with walls 2 meters thick and a roof built to shed both storm debris and lightning strike. And there, over a meal Caliph's suit filters would not let him taste but accepted out of some instinct toward manners, Bertrand told them how it had started. "We didn't choose this place," he said. "Nobody chooses this place. Our ship went down 81 years ago, colony vessel for 112 souls, meant for a world 3 systems over that turned out to have already been claimed. Territorial dispute. Someone shot out our drive core to make a point. We didn't have the fuel to reach anywhere else." He said this without visible bitterness, the way a man recounts a fact so old it has become geology. "The pilots put us down here because the atmospheric readings said we had maybe 6 hours before hull failure regardless. 6 hours here or certain death in the black. They chose the 6 hours. And you survived," Calith said. 412 of us survived the landing. 60 of us survived the first year." Bertrand's expression did not change, but something in his voice thinned. "The storms took some. The atmosphere took more. We didn't have suits rated for this world. We had suits rated for the world we were supposed to reach. The local wildlife took the rest. There were things out there in the first years, big things, fast things, that treated us like the easiest meal that had ever walked onto their planet." Calith thought of the previous 11 catalogued colonies. He thought of the Threlqui outpost for months. The Osvari camp less than that. 60 survivors from 412 was, by any measure, not survival, it was catastrophe. "I don't understand how you're still here," he admitted. "Every other attempt to settle this world ended within a season. What did you do differently?" Bertrand was quiet for a while, turning a cup of something dark and steaming between his weathered hands. "We didn't do anything clever at first," he said finally. "We just refused to stop. That's not a strategy. That's just what we do. My grandmother used to say humans are the species that argues with the ground itself when it tells us we can't live somewhere. We buried our dead and we kept building. We lost people to the storms, so we learned to read the sky better than any instrument could, because instruments break in eyes and instinct don't. We lost people to the atmosphere, so the engineers, we had 2 engineers left out of 60, figured out how to filter it using local minerals nobody back home would have thought to combine that way. We lost people to the predators." He paused, and for the first time, something like a smile crossed his face, thin and hard one. "And then we stopped losing people to the predators." "How?" "We stopped treating them like monsters and started treating them like neighbors we hadn't been introduced to properly." Calith's translator rendered this literally, and for a moment he assumed it was an idiom he did not understand. Bertrand seemed to read his confusion and gestured with his cup toward the settlement's outer wall. "Come. I'll show you." What Bertrand showed him. Walking the perimeter of the settlement as the light began to fail and the eastern sky darkened with the leading edge of an approaching storm, defied nearly everything Calith's professional training had told him to expect. There were enclosures along the settlement's eastern edge, low and sturdy, and inside them moved creatures Calith recognized with a lurch of memory from the survey archive's most harrowing entries. 6-limbed, armor-plated, built low to the ground with jaws designed for something considerably larger than the local vegetation. The Osvari final transmission, the one with the single garbled word, had included grainy footage of something very like this in the last seconds before the feed cut. "You domesticated them," Calith said, and heard his own voice come out unsteady. "We met a pair of these on the way in, or something very like them. They paced us for almost 2 minutes and then simply left." "That'll have been a scouting pair," Bertrand said, unsurprised. "They still run patrols out past the fields, same as they always have. Difference now is they report back to us as much as to their own pack elders. We learned to read their body language before we ever earned their trust. Ears back means uncertain, not aggressive, no matter what your instincts tell you. Took 3 generations to get here. They're pack hunters, smart ones. Smarter than we gave them credit for at first, which is probably why they nearly wiped us out early on. My great-grandfather's generation figured out they respected strength and consistency more than force. You don't fight a pack like that. You outstubborn it. You show up every day, you don't run, you don't panic, and eventually, it takes years, it took generations, they start treating you like part of the territory instead of prey in it." As if summoned by the conversation, one of the creatures in the nearest enclosure lifted its plated head and fixed Calith with an unblinking, amber-eyed stare that held nothing of the mindless hunger the Osvari's final transmission had suggested, and everything of calm, deliberate assessment. A young human girl, no older than 8 or 9 by Calith's estimate, walked along the enclosure's inner fence without hesitation and pressed her small hand flat against the creature's flank. It leaned into the touch the way a hound leans into an old friend. "That's my granddaughter's animal," Bertrand said, something warm breaking through the weathered lines of his face for the first time since they had met. "Named him after a storm that nearly took the eastern wall down 3 years back. Seemed fitting. Now he guards the fields at night. Better than any sensor grid the consortium ever fielded. They can smell a storm changing 4 hours before it hits." Beyond the enclosures, the fields continued in their careful furrows, and Caliph saw now what he had missed from the ship's scanners. An irrigation system, channeling water from a distant river through a network of clay and metal pipes, engineered to survive the corrosive rainfall that had ended so many other expeditions. "The plants aren't native," Bertrand continued, reading Caliph's attention. "Nothing edible on this world is safe for us, not without generations of adaptation we didn't have time for. We brought seed stock down in the crash. Barely any of it survived the landing, but what did, we protected like it was the last thing that mattered, because it was. Took 40 years of selective growing before we had crops that could handle this soil and this rain. My mother spent her whole life on that work. She never saw the fields at their best. I did." Caliph looked out over the ordered rows, over the low humming fence, over the settlement's smoke rising into a sky the color of an old wound, and felt the careful architecture of his professional detachment beginning to crack. "Why doesn't the consortium know about any of this?" he asked. 81 years. Someone should have found you before now." "Someone did," Bertrand said, and his voice went quiet in a different way. "Twice." Caliph went still. "What happened?" "First time about 30 years back. A survey ship, not unlike yours. They saw the fence, the fields, same as you did. And they panicked. Thought we were some new predator species that had built structures, opened fire before anyone spoke a word. We lost 11 people that day, including my father." Bertrand's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the memory's weight. "We fought back. We won, because we'd spent 70 years learning to survive on the worst planet anyone's ever tried to live on, and they hadn't spent a day of it. Their ship never made it back to orbit. And the second time? 15 years ago. Different approach. That crew didn't attack. They studied us instead, from a distance, quietly, for almost a month, and we let them because we'd learned by then that not everyone who comes from the sky wants to kill us. And then one night they were just gone. No goodbye. No contact." Bertrand's eyes, when they met Caliph's, held something between old grief and old anger. "We found out later, through the transmission relay we'd built to listen for exactly this. Someone out there talking about us, that their report had been filed and buried. Officially, we don't exist. Officially, Vulkars killed every human who ever landed here, the same as it apparently kills everyone else. It was easier for the record to say that than to explain what we actually were." Caliph felt something cold settle into his chest, a feeling he recognized, distantly, as shame on behalf of an institution he had spent his career serving faithfully. "What were you?" he asked quietly. "What did their report call you? That made it easier to bury?" Bertrand looked at him for a long moment, and behind the old man's tired eyes Caliph saw something that was not quite pride and not quite defiance, but adjacent to both. "A problem," Bertrand said. "We were a problem. A planet the consortium had already decided to write off as permanently forbidden, uninhabitable, a lesson in what happens to species that overreach, and here we were, alive on it, thriving on it, proving the lesson wrong. Easier to erase us than to rewrite the lesson." The storm that had been building on the eastern horizon reached the settlement 2 hours after dark, and Caliph understood, in the space of that night, precisely why Vulkars had earned its reputation across a dozen extinguished expeditions. The wind arrived first, a wall of pressure that made the thick-walled hall groan on its foundations. Then the lightning began. Not the isolated strikes of a normal storm, but a continuous, strobing violence that turned the narrow windows into flickering portraits of a sky trying to tear itself apart. Caliph's suit alarms screamed warnings about atmospheric pressure swings that would have killed him in seconds outside. And even through the hall's reinforced walls, he could feel the storm's fury as a physical pressure against his chest. The humans around him did not panic. They moved through the practiced choreography of a people who had lived through this exact violence hundreds of times across generations. Children ushered to the hall's reinforced center, elders directing younger hands toward shuttered vents and braced doorways, someone singing, low and steady, a song Calith's translator did not attempt to render because some things, it seemed to understand, were not meant to be reduced to information. Bertrand sat beside him through the worst of it, unbothered in the specific way of a man who has simply run out of room to be afraid of something so familiar. First 50 years, we lost people every storm season, he said, raising his voice over the wind. Buildings weren't strong enough. We didn't understand the pressure patterns. Now, he gestured at the shuddering, groaning, unbroken walls around them. Now the storms are just Tuesday. Midway through the worst of it, a sound cut through the wind that made every head in the hall turn at once. A sharp metallic groan from somewhere near the northern vents, followed by a young man's shout. Calith tensed, certain he was about to witness the exact catastrophe the survey archives had documented a dozen times over. But the response around him was neither panic nor paralysis. 3 men were already moving before Bertrand had fully risen from his seat, hauling a length of braced timber toward the failing vent cover with the unhurried urgency of people executing a drill they had run 100 times before. Within minutes the groaning stopped, the vent held, and the 3 returned to their places dripping and wind-scoured but entirely unshaken, as though they had done nothing more remarkable than close a window. Northern vents always been temperamental, Bertrand said, settling back down as though nothing at all had happened. We'll reinforce it properly come the dry season. For now, 3 strong hands and a length of timber does the job it's always done. Calith found he had been holding his breath, and let it out slowly, unsettled by how thoroughly the settlement's calm had nearly convinced him there was nothing here worth fearing at all. Right up until the wind had reminded him, with a single tearing groan of metal, exactly how much there still was. Calith thought of the 11 civilizations in his catalog. He thought of proud, capable species with technology far beyond what these people had carried out of a crashed colony ship, species that had died within months of contact with this exact violence. He thought of his own careful academic language, the clinical phrasing he used in his reports to describe extinction as though it were merely a data point, population collapse consistent with environmental incompatibility. He understood, sitting in that shuddering hall while the sky screamed outside, that he had never actually understood the difference between a species that died and a species that simply refused to. The storm broke before dawn, the way Vulkars' storms always broke, all at once, as though some vast pressure valve had finally released. Calith stepped outside into a morning washed clean and strange. The bruised sky paled to something almost gentle, and found the settlement already stirring. People checking the fence line, inspecting the fields for damage, calling to each other across the wet, glinting rooftops with the easy competence of routine. Nobody had died. Nobody, Bertrand told him quietly, had died in a storm in 11 years. Calith spent 4 more days on Vulkars, and every hour of them dismantled another piece of the professional certainty he had carried down from orbit. He walked the fields with agricultural specialists who had never left this planet and had nonetheless solved problems in corrosive soil cultivation that entire consortium research divisions had failed to crack. He watched children, actual children, born and raised in a place the galaxy's own records insisted was uninhabitable, learn to read storm patterns in the color of the western sky, the way children elsewhere learned their alphabet. He sat with the settlement's small council, elected rather than inherited, and listened to them debate irrigation schedules with the same seriousness the consortium's high assembly brought to matters of interstellar law. On the last night, he stood with Bertrand on the settlement's eastern wall, watching the sun, pale and diffuse through Vulkars' bruised atmosphere, sink toward a horizon lined with black mountains. "You have to file your report," Bertrand said. It was not a question. "Yes. Same as the others." Calith was quiet for a moment. "The others filed a report that erased you. I don't intend to do the same." Bertrand turned to look at him, something guarded and old in his expression. The look, Calith understood, of a man who had been disappointed by the sky before and had built an entire life on the assumption that he would be disappointed by it again. Why not? Calith thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I've spent my career studying how civilizations die," he said finally. "I have 11 case files on species that came to this exact planet and were extinguished, in some cases within weeks, and I have spent years writing careful, respectful, thorough accounts of every one of those deaths, because I believe that was the most important thing a scholar could do, bear honest witness to what does not survive. He looked out over the fields, the fence, the low smoke rising from the settlement's chimneys into a healing sky. I have never once had the chance to bear witness to what does. I am not going to waste it. The consortium won't like the report, Bertrand said. No, Calith agreed. They won't. Vulkars is on the list of worlds they intend to seal permanently, and part of the reason they intend to seal it is that its death toll is politically convenient. A clean, simple lesson about the limits of expansion, unmuddied by inconvenient survivors. A report confirming a thriving human settlement changes that calculation considerably. Some of them will want to bury it, the way the last one was buried. Then why risk it? Calith looked at the old man for a long moment, weighing 11 case files of the dead against 4 days spent among the stubbornly, defiantly living, and found the choice was not difficult at all. Because burying the truth is how a mystery like your people stays a footnote instead of becoming the lesson it should be, he said. I intend to make sure it isn't buried again. The transmission Calith filed from orbit 3 days later ran to over 400 pages, and unlike his previous 11 case studies, it did not open with the word extinction. It opened with a single line, stripped of the careful academic hedging that had characterized his entire career. Vulkars has not killed everyone. It has simply been waiting for someone who refused to die. What followed was the most thorough account any consortium scholar had ever produced of a colony's survival against catastrophic odds. The crash, the first brutal decades of loss, the slow, hard-won mastery of an environment that had annihilated every other species that attempted it, the domestication of apex predators through nothing more sophisticated than patience and stubbornness, the 40-year agricultural project that had turned poisoned soil into working fields, the 2 prior contacts, one violent and one cowardly, both erased from the official record to preserve a convenient narrative about a world too hostile for life. Calith included everything. The names of the 11 dead colonists killed by the panicked survey crew 30 years prior. The buried report from the expedition that had studied the settlement in silence and then vanished without explanation, filed somewhere in the consortium's archives under a classification that had kept its contents from ever reaching a xenological review board. The population figures, the agricultural yields, the storm survival statistics that had improved year over year, from catastrophic to nearly perfect. He knew, sending it, that it would not be received quietly. He knew that some faction within the consortium would move to suppress it exactly as the previous report had been suppressed, that the political convenience of a hell world with a body count in the trillions across a dozen species was not something certain administrators would give up without a fight. But he had also, in his 4 days on Vulkars, done one thing that made suppression considerably harder. He had left 3 independent data relays hidden among the settlement's outer buildings, transmitting continuous corroborating telemetry to any receiver within range at Bertrand's quiet insistence. If we go silent again, the old man had said, gripping Calith's hand at the ship's ramp with a strength that belied his age. Someone besides you needs to already know why. The ashvane quiet lifted off Vulkars on a morning clear enough to see the black mountains all the way to the horizon, and Calith watched the settlement shrink beneath him. The fence, the fields, the low smoke rising steady and unafraid into a sky that had killed everything else that ever tried to live beneath it. The consortium's response, when it came 6 weeks later, was not what Calith had expected, and not entirely what he had feared. There was no quiet suppression. His report, corroborated by 3 independent relays that could not be quietly disappeared the way a single expedition's files once had been, had already circulated too widely before anyone in a position of authority could intervene. Junior xenologists across a dozen institutes had accessed it within days. It had been cited, argued over, copied, forwarded. By the time the consortium's administrative apparatus decided what its official position would be, the position had effectively already been decided for it by several thousand scholars who found the story of Vulkars considerably more compelling than the sanitized silence that had governed it for 81 years. There were, predictably, dissenting voices. A senior minister from the same ministry that had buried the previous survey's findings argued at length. In a session Calith was permitted to observe but not address, that formal contact risked destabilizing decades of careful policy regarding forbidden world classifications, that if one hell world could be quietly conquered by patience and stubbornness, Then every other permanently sealed system in the consortium's registry would face renewed pressure from settlers, prospectors, and desperate refugees convinced they too might beat impossible odds. It was not, the minister admitted under pointed questioning, an argument about whether the people of Vulkars were real. It was an argument about what their existence would cost everyone else's carefully maintained certainty. Caliph found he had an answer for that too, though no one had asked him to give it. He requested the floor, was granted 3 minutes by a chair clearly reluctant to give a junior xenologist any platform at all, and used every second of it. You are welcome to reclassify every forbidden world in the registry if you believe the precedent is dangerous, he said. But I would ask the council to consider what it means that the precedent already exists, whether we acknowledge it or not. 81 years ago, 412 people were shot out of the sky and left to die on a world our own records insist kills everyone. 60 of them survived that first year. Today, their descendants number in the low thousands, and they have solved agricultural and behavioral problems that our finest research divisions have not managed to solve in far gentler conditions. That is not a policy question. That is simply what happened. My report does not ask the consortium to decide whether it is convenient. It asks the consortium to decide whether it is honest. The vote, when it came 3 days later, was not unanimous. But it was decisive. What Caliph received instead, in a formal transmission bearing seals from 3 separate consortium ministries, was an instruction. Prepare to return as lead liaison for formal first contact. He read the message twice, standing in his old office at the Threll Institute, surrounded by the 11 case files of extinguished civilizations that had defined his entire career until 4 days on a planet that was supposed to kill everyone taught him something those files never could. Extinction was not the only lesson a hostile world had to teach. Sometimes, if a species was stubborn enough, patient enough, willing enough to bury its dead and keep building anyway, the lesson a world taught was survival instead. He drafted his reply that evening, a formal acceptance, brief and professional, exactly as protocol required. But before he sent it, he added a line the ministries had not asked for and would not have expected. A line meant not for the consortium's records but for a gray-haired man standing on a fence line 81 light-years away, who had spent his entire life proving a dead world wrong. Tell them, Bertrand had said at the ramp, that we're still here. Caliph typed the words into the report's final line, where the 11 case files before it had always closed with a date, a cause, and a quiet confirmation of extinction. This one closed differently. Population, growing. Status, alive. Vulkars has not finished with humanity yet, and for the first time in 81 years that is no longer a threat. It is a promise. He sent the transmission, and for the first time in a career built entirely on documenting endings, Ren Caliph looked forward to writing what came next. The return voyage took the better part of a month, and Caliph spent most of it not in his cabin among old files but on the observation deck, watching the slow wheel of unfamiliar stars and thinking about the 11 case files he had once considered the finest work of his career. He had written them with genuine care. He believed that still had tried in every one to give the dead their due, to record not just how a colony had failed but who its people had been before the failure took them. He did not regret those years. But he understood now that he had mistaken thoroughness for completeness, had spent a career believing that a world's verdict, once rendered, was final, without ever once asking what happened to a species that simply declined to accept the verdict at all. When the Ashvane quiet finally dropped back into Vulkar's bruised, familiar sky, Caliph stood at the viewport beside Dree, watching the grid of the settlement resolve out of the rust-colored haze exactly as it had the first time. The fence, the fields, the low chimney smoke rising steady into a sky that had killed everything else that had ever tried to live beneath it, and had, at last, been made to answer for the one people it could not. Bertrand was waiting at the gate when the ramp lowered, exactly where Caliph had left him. Flanked now by a delegation the old man had clearly spent weeks assembling. Younger faces, council members, a woman introduced as the settlement's chief engineer who studied the consortium shuttle with an expression of frank, professional curiosity rather than fear. Behind them, the fence hummed with its familiar current, and beyond it, framed against the black mountains, the fields stretched on in their careful, hard-won rows, exactly as alive as they had been the day Caliph first found them and refused to let the galaxy pretend otherwise. Told you we'd still be here, Bertrand said, and for the first time since Caliph had met him, The old man's smile reached all the way to his eyes. "I never doubted it," Calith said, and meant it completely. Behind him, the ship's cargo bay doors opened on the first formal delegation Vulkars had ever welcomed instead of buried, and somewhere above them both, in an archive that had once catalogued nothing but endings, a new file was already being opened, one that, for the first time in 81 years, did not begin with the word extinction. The end.